as luck would have it, I got linked up with Billy Beane around about 2006 and ended up working with Billy. No one comes to a data analyst just to spend the time of day and chat about data. Managers come to analysts because they got a problem. The only club that basically took me seriously was Bolton Wanderers. Big Sam was very quiet, very thoughtful, very quiet, said very little. He was taking it all in. So I started to model the league outcomes based on those performance statistics. And then I took that back to the individual players and started to develop a player rating system. We spent 2 days holed up in a hotel in the centre of Leeds talking about how to run a football club and how to run it properly, and the role of data analytics. With the agreement of the head coach, who was analytically aware and progressive. And that was a certain character called Arne. That's evidence, that's data. That should be being analysed and used. And I guarantee if you take a more data analytics approach to scouting, for example, you're going to get a lot more out of your scouts. So you'll also use your scouts better.
Hello and welcome back to the podcast, and today's guest is Bill Gerrard. So Bill has been involved in sports analytics for pretty much as long as I have been alive, so it's an absolute pleasure to welcome Bill onto the channel to speak about analysis and hear about some of his prior experiences. So Bill originally comes from an economics background and got involved in sports analytics in the early to mid 90s. And he has experience in various sports, but mainly football and rugby. So Bill also has experience working with Billy Beane. So Billy Beane is obviously famous around the whole Moneyball situation. I'm sure many of you either read the book, but have definitely seen the film. So Bill has had the pleasure of working with Billy Beane in the past. And so we speak around his experiences in that too. So absolutely fascinating conversation, and I really enjoyed speaking with Bill. So before we get into the conversation, I want to quickly ask you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so, and if you enjoy this video, consider giving it a thumbs up. And finally, a reminder, this video is sponsored by InPlay Online, which is a cloud-based video analysis software. More on that later. So without further ado, let's get Bill into the conversation. Bill, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, Chris, particularly since my team is top of the championship and looking to get back to the hallowed land of the Premiership.
Indeed, definitely. So I'm really looking forward to speaking. We've only just started recording, but we've been speaking half an hour just purely about football and Leeds and Sunderland, the Championship. So I really enjoyed the conversation so far, Bill. So what I'm going to do, Bill, is I'm going to pass it over to you straight away. So for me, at least, being involved in analysis, I've known the name Bill Gerrard for a while. I've seen your work, but obviously up until now we've never actually spoken. So firstly, it's a pleasure to finally speak with you. But for those that don't know who you are, Bill, I'm going to give it straight over to you just to give yourself a quick introduction.
Okay, thanks, Chris, and thanks for the invitation to join your podcast. Much appreciated. I'm Bill Gerrard. You can probably tell from the accent I hail from north of the border originally, the northeast of Scotland. But my first love Celtic, but like a lot of Scots of my generation, I'm a Leeds United fan, and it's almost poetic justice that, or written in the stars, that I should end up living and working in Leeds for most of my life. If there's anywhere, if I'm not going to live in Scotland, I wouldn't live anywhere else than Yorkshire, which I love, and I love all my sports, and to be in Leeds, to have football, rugby league, cricket, you name it, ice hockey. Now it's great. It's a great city, and I love living here. I'm a professor of business management at Leeds University, but my background is principally in economics and in data analytics. I've always been passionate about sport. I was one of those. I played amateur football and a few other sports, but mainly football until my late 30s. I was one of those that was 99% enthusiasm and 1% skill. But I had a great time, and I played in Canada, played in Australia, about through teaching commitments. In fact, it was a Sheffield-born professor of economics who was based out in Canada, who I got to know in the late 80s, and he invited me out to play for his team for 3 summers out in Winnipeg. He said he couldn't pay me to play, but I could pay my way by doing some teaching. So I taught economics during the day at the University of Manitoba and played in the football leagues there, which was great. So I've always loved my sport. I've always loved the numbers in sport. I'm one of those that I've got childhood memories of working through this massive volume in the library that had every scorecard from every test match played since they started playing international test matches in cricket. When I played a bit of cricket, and yeah, Scots do play some cricket, I used to end up, guess what, doing the scorecard when I wasn't batting and that. And so I've always had a fascination with the numbers and that. And I was able to, never managed to get into football, into elite sport with my boots. But I did manage to get in with my laptop. And I started back in the mid-90s. I managed to find a way to take my professional expertise in economics and data analysis and combine it with my passion for sport, and ended up spending from most of the time from about the mid-1990s through until the pandemic, one way or another involved in elite sport, a lot of time in football. But I also got heavily involved in rugby union and rugby league, and have done bits and pieces in other sports as well, including cycling. So yeah, I'm now semi-retired, so I'm still at the university. I teach data analytics and sports analytics at the university, and I research partly in the area of sport, but I also continue to do research on a number of topics in economics. And in fact, my current research project um, with one of my colleagues is looking at the impact of catastrophic disruption of global supply chains. So I still retain my interest in business economics, but and in sport. In terms of sport and participation these days, I've fallen back into love with long distance running. So I run every day. And that's from the heritage of being brought up in the northeast of Scotland. We used to have long, hard winters, and when the sports teacher couldn't put us out to play football, they sent us out in cross country. I was never an athlete, but I had two things that were good for long distance running. I had the experience of running after a ball for years and years, so I built up stamina. And the other thing is, I've got perseverance. I don't like to give up, and that's pretty helpful when you're running. So yeah, I run every day now. That's my. I'm also a qualified coach. I did a football coach, and I got my UEFA B license, and I coached at the university. I coached in the local schools. But I had to give that one up when I was given the choice. I could either be an amateur coach or be a data analyst with elite teams, but I didn't have enough time to also be a professor and do both of them. So I decided to be a data. I always thought I'd be more useful as a data analyst at the elite level than as a coach. So I gave up the coaching, but I love coaching, and I love the tactical analysis of the games, and I've been fortunate to be able to combine that with data analytics and use that in the elite arena. So yeah, I've had some interesting times.
So I hope you're enjoying the video so far, but I have a really quick interruption for anybody with an interest in video analysis. So if that's you, please do click the link down below the video for In Play Online. So just to give a quick overview, because I think it'll be relevant to a lot of people that are watching this particular video. So In Play Online is a cloud-based video analysis software. So it allows you to tag your videos, and when you've done your tagging, that includes adding labels, adding comments, adding notes and voice notes even, and you can even illustrate and draw over your clip. So if you are an aspiring analyst looking for your job and you want to create a portfolio of work, if you're a scout looking to make your kind of reports a little bit better and more animated, if you're a coach looking to get into analysis a little bit more, then this tool will be great for you, because it starts at just £15 a month. So once you've done your analysis, you can add all the clips to different playlists, which can be downloaded and exported offline. You can put them into presentations and also share them to different people within your team. So it comes with a whole bunch of other features, but I'll let you click the link down below if you are interested. As I say, packages start at just £15 a month, so it's a very affordable solution if you are looking for something to help with your video analysis. So that's it for the interruption. Let's get back to the video. Perfect. So we're going to try and unpack kind of a 30+ year career in the next hour or so, Bill. So we're definitely not going to be able to cover everything, but we're going to try our best. So just on the kind of your background, you mentioned kind of economics graduate. You're not the first one, actually. I think there's been a few previous guests that work in elite sport that come from that same background. So that's first interesting point there. I'm got your LinkedIn profile up as well, Bill. So again, just to kind of go through the different roles you've had. So just to kind of put into context the timeline here. So your first job on LinkedIn is listed 1983, industrial economist at Unilever. So we're going back a fair whack there. And it's interesting because I was trying to, and I think we spoke before I started recording, when I was kind of introduced to analysis. So it was about 2008 or 7-ish when I first knew that analysis of sport actually was a thing. Like before that, I didn't know. Yet there's videos on YouTube of you going back to 2007. So that's, puts into perspective the time that you've been involved in this industry. So It really is quite amazing. And as well, which I'm going to link below, Bill, is your blog, your website. So you've got posts on there that go back dated all the time when you've been kind of doing the bits and pieces you've been doing. So I just love the fact you can go back and see what you were writing and thinking 10, 15, 20 years ago. So I'm definitely going to link that below for people to check out as well. So one line that is on your profile, Bill, is your expertise lies in developing performance analysis systems to support coaches in elite sport. So what does that can you just kind of expand on that a little bit, Bill? I know you've mentioned different sports you've been involved in, just a little bit more on kind of the systems.
Yeah, it's. I guess the reason I put that line in is because it originally, when I first got into applying my economics and my data analysis skills in sport, I wasn't working with coaches. And I should say, my first job being in Unilever, a lot of the work that I've done in sport is equivalent to what I was doing at Unilever. I did my first degree at Aberdeen, my local university, and then I was fortunate enough to get a place to study economics at Cambridge, and so I did my master's degree at Cambridge, and I got the chance to stay on and do a doctorate. But I was one of those that I didn't want to be purely an academic and in the closed confines of academia. I always saw myself as someone who wanted to teach. I was brought up in Scotland where education's the way to get on. So I wanted to teach, but I also wanted to research and do research that was practical. So the follow-up, instead of doing a PhD and doing academic research, I went into an industrial economics, into an economics department in a big multinational company, Unilever. And what I ended up there was doing what we'd call data analytics, because basically what I was doing for those managers, they had a problem. They only come to data analysts. No one comes to a data analyst just to spend the time of day and chat about data. Managers, be they in business or in sport, come to analysts because they got a problem. That managers, coaches, whoever they are, have got responsibility for performance. And they come to analysts when there's a problem, that the performance is not what they want it to be, and they want some analysis done to try and better understand what's causing the underperformance and what to do about it. So ultimately, analysts are always servants, and they're serving a purpose. So analytics, I use the word data analytic, the term data analytics, to mean data analysis for practical purpose. I don't think many academics do data analytics. I think they do a lot of data analysis, but they don't do much in the way of data analytics, because you've got to get out in the real world to do data analytics. You've got to work directly with managers. And that's what I did at Unilever. So one of the first jobs I had was, this shows my age, the Unilever operating company in what was then West Germany, responsible for cup of soup, was losing market share. And they wanted to know why they were losing market share. I did that piece of work, and it led me on to being asked to find out why company, the Dutch operating company, was losing market. No, sorry, it was in Belgium, was losing market share in the mayonnaise market. And what I was doing was modelling the market shares. Yeah. And one of the interesting things I threw up in the Belgium study was that the major rival was Kraft. And I was getting data on how much Kraft was spending on advertising. And what I was able to do was find out that it didn't matter what Kraft was advertising. The Kraft brand name was so strong that if they advertised Kraft, I don't know, baked beans, it was having an impact on the sales of Kraft mayonnaise. Yeah. So, and that led to a change in behaviour by the operating managers for Unilever in that, because what they then recognised, they couldn't just look at what Kraft was doing in the mayonnaise market. They had to look at what Kraft was doing. That's what I mean by data analytics. And the other thing that came out there was that there was a concern within Unilever that economists and well, we want to call data analysts, but economists were seen as having that masters of the universe attitude, very arrogant. We know the numbers, we can tell you what to do. And I was given a warning about that before. I said, I'm not like that. And sure enough, the manager that I was working for, that I was true to my word. I said, you guys have a lot more knowledge and experience and expertise about the markets. I can see patterns in the numbers, but you know what that patterns and what it is in real terms I'm picking up. So if we work together, that's a powerful combination. And indeed, I could have had a very successful career at Unilever. In the operating man, the marketing director I did some work for in West Germany, wrote a half-page summary of my report about how useful it had been to work with the economics and do in the analysis, and that would have career path, but that wasn't the career path I wanted. But it's the attitude I took into sport, that I know what I bring to the table, I know what I don't bring to the table, and the people I'm working with, they've got the context. So that's the attitude I've always had with the coaches. So that was my if you like learning ground at Unilever. I went in and I spent 10 years as an academic, initially at Leeds, then at York, and I was teaching statistics, teaching economics, and a lot of my research was actually about, if you like, the fundamentals of, because I found economics incredibly abstract and had rather strange conceptions of the world. And I wanted to understand that. So I ended up spending about 10 years studying methodology, and I wasn't doing much in the way of economics, practical economics. I did do one study on, I ended up doing some studies on the location of firms, and did it matter whereabout in a city that you located in versus outer. So I did some practical work, but it was coming back to coming back to the University of Leeds. I decided to move back as they were creating the business school, and to reorientate my work towards the industry that I had a passion for, which was sport. And with a good friend that I met in Leeds, who was an economist, but a sports fanatic, a guy called Steve Dobson. Steve and I started to work on, in fact, the project started, would you believe it, Headingley watching a test match in 1994. And I told Steve that I was moving back to the University of University of Leeds, and that I wanted to do more applied work. And I said, one of the things I was thinking about was looking at the transfer market in football. And was there some rhyme and reason for the valuations of players? And Steve said to me, well, if that's the way you want to go, let's work together. Because Steve and another former colleague of mine, John Goddard, they published some papers on statistical analysis of football attendance data. They were both sports fans. Steve was a Leicester man. John was an Ars, Queen's Park Rangers fan. So they had an interest. So they knew this literature in sports economics. I had these ideas of what might be driving the valuations of players in the transfer market, and I had the statistical skills. So Steve and I worked together, and we presented some papers at a conference, and it got quite at economics conferences. It generated a bit of media interest. And there started to be stories, mad scientific boffins think they can model the football transfer market. Well, actually could. The model I developed to the transfer market, we had data for I'm giving my age away, the top 4 divisions in England, Division 1 to Division 4, what we now call the Premiership, Championship, League 1, League 2. But so we had data, and we had data on 1,350 transfers between English clubs from 1990 to 1996. That included the Alan Shearer world record transfer from Blackburn to Newcastle for 15 million. We also, I think the second biggest one we had was Andy Cole going to Man United. So we had this, but we also had transfers as low values as £5,000, players moving between Division 4 clubs. So we had this huge data set, and we managed to get some funding to employ 3 students to help us go through what was then called the Rothmans Football Yearbook. There was no data to download from the internet in those days, so we had to go through. I've still got the complete collection from 1970 of the football, what was then the Rothmans, but of course no tobacco advertising these days, so it's gone through a number of renames. But that was, for sad anoraks like myself, that was the statistical Bible for football. All the data we could have was there, and in those days, all we had was, we knew the date of birth, but basically in terms of football data for players, we know for each match we only knew who played, who scored, and who had got who had got booked or sent off, because those were the three pieces of information the leagues needed to work out, were the players all registered that had played and who'd scored, so who got the points and so on. So that's all the data we had that was available. So we put together this data set, and I managed to create a model that captured about 80% of the variation in transfer fees, which is pretty amazing if you think that 80% of the variation in 1,350 transfer fees could be modelled. And so we presented, so we got the media coverage, but one of the things that came up from it was can you value individual players? So that's where my research went to, was into player valuation, and it took me into finance effectively. And actually, I ended up in the business school moving from economics into accounting and finance, because I started, first of all, to value players. So that took me into asset valuation. I was also starting at that point to analyse the performance of teams in business terms and football club data. So that's that. My work went that way. Steve wasn't interested in developing the player valuation, so I developed a player valuation system. The BBC picked up on it, and there was an old economics program called the Money program that used to be on Sunday night, and they did a 15-minute segment on me with Southampton cooperated. And it was just that I went in and I valued. And I always remember that the reason I'd come to prominence, a stockbroker had asked me to analyse the transfer dealings of Gerry Francis at Tottenham Hotspur. And I did some analysis, and the analysis effectively showed that the players that Gerry Francis had signed, a lot of them had lost a lot of value. Mike, this was a private report that was done for the stockbroker, and I estimated that Gerry Francis had lost in the order of £20 million of shareholder value. This was done for a stockbroker that worked for UBS. The next I'm in Leeds, I know nothing about what's going on. The next I start getting phone calls. There'd been in the evening newspaper in London, there'd been a headline on the back page: Swiss bank slams Spurs. This report had been handed to the media. Turned out, and then the media had done a bit of research and found that it turned out the stockbroker was an Arsenal supporter. And they thought, and then they found out that the character who'd done the analysis is a Leeds supporter. So there's a conspiracy theory here. This is, Arsenal and Leeds ganging up on Spurs. And I'm totally oblivious to all of this. I'm in Leeds and that. But yeah, so that started to generate a bit of interest. And I ended up getting involved in valuing players, because I developed this system for valuing players. But it wasn't where I really wanted to go. What I wanted to do was get more into the tactical side, the sporting side, rather than the business side. But I kept being pulled into the financial side, mainly because Leeds United at that point then went into a financial meltdown. And I was one of the first to work out that Leeds were going to go bankrupt. And so I ended up for about 2 years, my life was taken over by following the financial problems of Leeds United and becoming quite an outspoken critic of Peter Ridsdale and the board at that point. So I kept getting pulled into the financial side. At the same time, I was getting my coaching badges. I started coaching as a lot of parents with young children get involved, take their kids to the local team, get involved, and I progressed and got my UEFA B license, got involved with coaching various school teams. Also started working with the university team, and was fortunate to work with some really good people such as Ian Birchnall and Brian Dean, who were involved in the university team. And at the same time, after the Leeds saga, Leeds went, as I predicted, bankrupt and ended up in the Championship. And then Ken Bates came in. It was just at that point that we started to get. By this time, we're now talking around about 2003, 2004. That as things were beginning to, if you like, stabilise at Leeds, and I stepped back from getting involved in that and concentrated more. Now the data was becoming available on what was happening on the football pitch. So that's when and that coincides with the Moneyball story and so on. And that's when I moved to developing statistical analysis of performance on the pitch to try and provide the sort of evidential basis for coaches in much the same way I was trying to provide back at Unilever an evidential base for marketing directors and product managers to make their decisions about performance. I now had the data that I could analyse what was going on the football pitch and start to that and start to do a Moneyball, but in football.
Yeah.
But football wasn't that interested, and I ended up in rugby.
Yeah. So yeah, no, that's really interesting. So you went from kind of mayonnaise and baked beans to Premier League footballers, Bill. So
Well,
that's
valuing them, and then yeah. So
so
yeah, that was the progress from. So that comment I made about developing statistical systems to support coaches, that was very much where I wanted to be and started to be from about 2004, 2005 onwards. Prior to that, let's put it this way, it was the finance directors who were taking more interest in my work than the coaches. And what I found, particularly in football, it was incredibly difficult to get contact and talk with the coaching staff for a number of reasons. But I think between 2005 and 2010, I had contact with at least half of the Premiership clubs. The only club that basically took me seriously was Bolton Wanderers, where I did my coaching badges. Actually, they had a really good coach education system, and the very first presentation I ever made to an English football club was on an away day with Sam Allardyce and the coaching and support staff. October 2004, I made a presentation to them on Moneyball and its implications for football. And that was October 2004, a Wednesday afternoon. It was during the international break, and they'd organised an away day and in the morning they'd gone through all the confidential stuff. I was invited in the afternoon, and we had a session, and the chief executive of Bolton Wanderers came along to that, and we had a session about football and finance, effectively. And what I was asked to do was provide an understanding of the financial background in which the football operation was having to work. And I also took that opportunity to introduce the Moneyball, and that Big Sam was very quiet, very thoughtful, very quiet. Said very little. He was taking it all in, and that. But yeah, it provoked one or two. It was my first. I think it was probably my first experience of the degree of skepticism. That what could an academic who could do statistics possibly have anything useful to say to a group of ex-professional players who were now experienced coaches. So there were one or two of the coaching staff, one in particular was quite, so you telling us you can pick the team?
yeah.
And that's exactly, and in a sense it was, and I could understand where they were coming from. It was that antagonism that Economist and Unilever had created because they had because of their arrogance and of some of them and a lack of humility and a lack of respect to the experience and expertise of the people they were working with. So I could perfectly understand that, and I think that was a barrier, and there was a lot of, certainly in the early noughties, there was a lot of skepticism and downright hostility to data analytics and the use of data analytics in football. But that replicated what the response had been in baseball to Moneyball originally. And if you look at the first paperback edition of Moneyball, where Michael Lewis wrote the afterword. So this was the paperback edition came out a year after the hardback, and he added an afterword about the hostility that baseball had to the Moneyball when it was first published.
Yeah, I'm just thinking back to the book as well, but the film, the scene when they sat around the table with the old scouts and the skepticism and the kind of dismissiveness of them to kind of obviously Billy Beane and the data there. So yeah, that's really interesting because it's you did touch upon it a little bit, Bill, in terms of the work in the early days you were doing on these player values was more seen by, or at least the people that were interested in it were kind of the banks, the lawyers, in terms of kind of valuing a club's squad and rather than the coaches. Obviously, that's changing.
Yeah,
You have teams nowadays that adopt a full-on player trading strategy, and that's part of
yeah,
their, the way they operate is they try and value these players and find the undervalued, sell on to make a
yeah.
profit. It's amazing how different that has kind of come, or how far it's come on really from those days. Okay, so if you've made it this far into the video, you must be enjoying the content. Either that, or you have simply fallen asleep. So whichever one of them it is, you probably won't mind me asking you for a quick favour. So as you know, I'm always looking to grow the channel. So the bigger the channel gets, the more people we can reach and impact, but also the bigger and better guests we can invite onto the channel to have these types of chats. So with that in mind, if you haven't already done so, I would very much appreciate it if you did hit the subscribe button down below the video. The stats are showing around 25% of viewers are subscribed. So there's a big chunk of you that are watching the videos, but you haven't yet hit the subscribe button, but I will let you off because you can do it right now. It's free and it literally takes 1 second. So if you go down, click the subscribe button, it would mean a lot to the channel and help the channel to grow. So that's all for now. Let's get back to the video.
Yeah, I had one club that that took it seriously. That they asked me to do a squad valuation on an annual basis, but that interestingly was for deciding how much insurance coverage they needed for the squad.
Yeah.
And that yeah, it was part of it was done using the valuations to, because effectively the company accounts in terms of the assets, what they were recording was only the value of players that had been acquired. So for example, I used to teach a course called the Economics and Finance of Football, and one of the topics I did was intangible assets. Now, even for accountants, intangible assets can be quite a boring topic. But as soon as you ask the question, why was David Beckham never on the Manchester United balance sheet, but he was on the Real Madrid balance sheet? All of a sudden, it's a really interesting topic because in accounting terms, David Beckham was an internally generated asset. And the valuations that go on the balance sheet are of assets that have been acquired from a third party. So he went onto the Real Madrid balance sheet because his registration had been acquired from a third party, Man United. But in Manchester United's case, they had always had his registration. He was the first club and he was the only English club that he was registered for, apart from when he was on a temporary loan to Preston. So he was what was classed in accounting terms an internally generated asset. So the balance sheet was not a guide to the balance sheets are never a guide to the market value of assets. But in the case of footballers, not only are they only give you the historic value, and that's been reduced over time for so that it's allocated over time. So and secondly, they're only valuing those players that have been acquired. So if a player's has come through the academy or has come on a free transfer, they've got market value, but they've got no asset value in accounting terms. So I was trying to fill the gap and give a fair market value of the whole of the squad. And that had usefulness for insurance purposes. It also had usefulness in terms of teams that were got involved in financial transactions where they might be borrowing and wanted a true representation of their asset value, and the lenders wanted that. So there were a number of situations where I was providing a valuation that was being used for those purposes. And indeed, that was one of the, strangely, that was how I first got involved with Leeds United. And what I did a squad valuation that was used for an initial lending transaction, but then what I hadn't realised and didn't find out until later, that it had then been used as a justification as part of the package to justify the debt of 60 million, a securitization deal. I only found that out when the Sunday Times did an expose on the financial dealings of Leeds United. And my name was mentioned. I thought I had nothing to do with that deal, but then it turned out that the squad valuation that I'd provided for Leeds United had been used as part of the package, and the Sunday Times had seen the case that Leeds United had made for the 60 million. My problem wasn't the 60 million; it was how they spent it. And I said at the time, if you borrow 60 million long term, you should invest it long term. You invest it in a stadium. But what they did was they spent the 60 million uncovering the losses. And I think at one point I was quoted as saying, it was a bit like someone borrow mortgage in the house and then going on a cruise around the world and then coming back and think, oh gosh, I don't have a house anymore. I've sold that. I've had a good time. I've lived the dream. I think was
that's what he said.
So that's. And so the valuation, but all of those valuations, none of those were using directly any data about what the players were doing on the pitch other than appearances and goal scoring. And that's what changed by the time, you started to get companies like Prozon and Opta that started to emerge in the late 1990s. And my first attempt at trying to model what was happening on a football field came out of that. Opta published 4 yearbooks on the Premiership, and from 1998 through to 2002, they had 4 yearbooks, and they had 33 metrics, and they gave you the season totals for every player in the Premiership for those metrics. So I took those and created a huge amount of data, which I then reduced in the first instance to teams. So I had 20 teams, 4 seasons. So I eventually had reduced all of that to 80 rows of data for 80 rows and 33 variables. So I started to model the league outcomes based on those performance statistics. And then I took that back to the individual players and started to develop a player rating system, and had to learn the hard way about a lot of lessons I had to learn. For example, the first thing I did, you'll love this one, it looked like a goalkeeper. The very first time I rated the players, a goalkeeper was worth 10-ounce field players in terms of win contribution.
Okay.
The reason being the goalkeeper's metric, save shot ratio, was the best predictor of goals conceded. What the other players were doing was predicted the goals scored, because the defensive stats weren't very good, and anyway they paled into insignificance compared to the goalkeeper. So when you worked out the very first regression model that I've used to work out player ratings, the goalkeeper, because the goalkeeper's play was predictive of goals conceded, and goals conceded is 50% of the win contribution. The other 10 players, what they were doing was predicting goals scored. That very simple model had the goalkeeper was worth the 10 outfield players. So that was my first, oh, okay, this ain't going to be as easy as you think. So I ended up with a player rating system that I called STARS, Statistical Trend Analysis Rating System. So I had my STARS system, and what I realized fairly quickly was you couldn't do it purely statistically. You had to have a combination of, if you like, expert judgment on the weightings to apply to these. So I started to develop a system where I'd be weighting, and that. So I'd give the goalkeepers, would constrain that to being 1/11th. And so I had to impose weight, and so I used statistics statistical analysis to identify that, but I couldn't just use statistical analysis, because ultimately what people forget is statistics is value, if you like, statistics values or rates metrics in terms of the predictability of the outcome. So of course the actions that are closest to the end point are the most predictive. So if you just use statistics, the goalkeeper becomes the principal predictor of goals conceded. And then it's the shots on target are the principal predictor of goals scored. So if you use a statistical approach, most of the weighting will go on the shooting and the shooting metrics, but you can't. To score, you need to shoot and be on target. But to shoot, you need to have possession. You need to have the ball move forward into the attacking third. To move the ball forward, you need a passing and possession game. But to have that, you need to have gained possession in the first place. So you need a defensive game.
Yeah.
All of those stats, but if you, all of those metrics we know tactically are important, but statistically, the valuation, the ratings statistically will always give the greatest weightings to those metrics that are further down the causal chain.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to learn that. In retrospect, it's common sense,
Yeah.
but when you rush in, when you first start, you start throwing up, and then you get all the problems that all the defensive stats had the wrong sign. But of course, what the issue with the problems when you're trying to model defense statistically, one of the problems is you're modeling something that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Because defense is all, why didn't the dog, the Sherlock Holmes lines about the curious incident of the dog that didn't bark in the night. So in defensive stats, first of all, you're trying to model something not happening. The outcome is that there isn't a goal scored. And that's always more difficult than trying to model something that does happen.
Yeah.
Because you're modeling, here's things that have happened that are correlated with what has happened. But in defense, here are the things that have happened, the defensive plays, and you're trying to correlate that with something that hasn't happened. So you've got that problem. But then the other problem is because you defend, the more successful tackles and the more quality, if you like, in your defensive play, that's going to lead to score prevention. But of course, why are you tackling in the first place? Because the opposition have got possession, and the more possession they have, the more likely they are to score. So you're always got this quantity effect and the quality effect that your defensive stats are partly picking up your defensive ability, but they're also picking up the opposition and the amount of play that the opposition has had and the amount of attacking. So when and that's a challenge about trying to model what I call these invasion territorial sports, such as football, rugby, basketball, hockey. That it's the complexity is a real challenge, and you can't just go in there as a statistician. You've got to understand the context. And that means working with the coaches, working with the experts who really understand the game, and working with them in terms of how you model. And that's a challenge. And that's, as I said, that started round about 2002, 2003. In fact, first people that I developed, there was a well-developed sort of sport management fraternity, particularly in North America. So I started to go to their conferences and present there from about 1997 onwards. And I was actually, through those North American contacts, that I was actually presenting at the University of Michigan in the autumn of 2003 when the book Moneyball was published.
Yeah.
And I was being driven to Detroit Airport. I was catching a flight up to see some friends in Canada. And the guy who drove me, the prof who drove me to the airport, said, "Oh, you've got to read this book that's just come out. It's you, but baseball." And I picked up Moneyball in Detroit Airport at 6 o'clock on the Friday night. My flight was delayed. I think delayed in Minneapolis, my connection. I was going to Edmonton, actually. I didn't get there till about 2 a.m. And then I woke up about 6 o'clock. And by 7 o'clock that morning, or 6 that morning, I'd completed my first read of Moneyball. Here was someone who was actually doing in the real world of professional sport, was doing what I'd been theorizing about and trying to develop if you like, the statistical basis to do it in football. And here was someone, and then, as luck would have it, I got linked up with Billy Beane around about 2006 and ended up working with Billy, which was he's been a very good friend, a very good mentor. But yeah, Moneyball was a game changer, and I think the film was important that you mentioned because, yeah, you need a bit of time to read a book, but 1.5 hours, even top class coaches can switch off for an hour and a half, or at least semi switch off if they're watching a sports film. And I think the film did a good selling job to the other sports about the possibilities. It is a dramatized version, and I have to remind people that I've been lucky enough to see Billy Beane at work, and how Billy Beane runs the Oakland days, soon to be the Las Vegas days, is quite different to how Brad Pitt runs the Hollywood days. I've never seen Billy throw a seat, but there are certain mannerisms. I've got a high respect for Brad Pitt as an actor because he's captured certain of Billy's mannerisms, and there are a number of things in the film that are so accurate that I smile. For example, Billy doesn't watch games.
Yeah.
Because he's very concerned about, he knows he's emotional and gets wrapped up. So what he does is he follows the game. So when they were playing in the Coliseum in Oakland, Billy would go to the weight room. The first time I ever went to Oakland, I was sitting in Billy's seat, and then he sent a security guard at the bottom of the seventh to take me down to the clubhouse. So he listens to the game. So he goes through the emotion, the home games, and that he goes through the emotion of that, listening to it. So he knows the score, he knows what's happened, but he doesn't watch the video until the following morning. And when he can watch it in a much more objective manner. And that's the other thing. Billy watches video. The data is another piece of evidence. He's an evidence-based person, and video is data. It's evidence. So he uses a video. I remember saying that to a director of scouting, and whose comment was, Moneyball's a bit of an albatross then, isn't it? Because he'd formed the view that it was all about the numbers. And his concern was, what about the scouts? And in fact, there was a whole group of scouts waiting to come in to see the director of scouting while I was in the meeting. I said, you'll get more out of the scouts if you're using data analytics properly. You'll get more out of the scouts because you'll the data. How much dust or electronic dust are all your scouting reports? That's evidence. That's data. That should be being analysed and used. And I guarantee if you take a more data analytics approach to scouting, for example, you're going to get a lot more out of your scouts. So you'll also use your scouts better. Because one of the problems with scouting is that scouts tend to go to the same places. They talk to one another. So they all spot the same potential star. And what does that do? Bid the price up. You're not going to uncover the hidden diamonds by talking to everyone else who's trying to uncover the hidden diamonds. You're all going to uncover the same diamonds, and the players' agents is just going to be rubbing their hands, thinking, "Thank you very much. That's bidding the price up." That's about. And so Billy was, and the techniques they were using at Oakland was to use all the available data. So yeah, Billy doesn't watch games because it's the other thing. When Billy got remarried, his second wife asked him, "Why don't we get the local newspaper?" He said, "I don't want to see the local newspaper. I don't want to be under pressure from what the local media are saying about Oakland. What I want to do is look at the other 29 newspapers, the local newspapers of the other 29 general managers to see the pressure, because that's useful information." And so that scene in the film where he's talking with his daughter and she says, "Are you going to get sacked?" He says, "When do you read that?" And she says, "Oh, it was on the internet." So don't read the papers, don't look at the internet. That's referring to that Billy is very sensitive to, or very aware of, the power of the media, and he wants to use that to his advantage in the trading scenario rather than being put under unnecessary pressure that might be disadvantageous for him. So he's very, very aware of the emotion and the pressure that the media can bear. So he tries to insulate himself from that. So yeah, there's a lot in the film that's very accurate. And I think the best line in the film was, your aim should be to buy wins, not players. And that sums up and I still teach in sports analytics. I'm teaching students, when I come to player ratings, I'm teaching them how to try and sensibly evaluate win contributions. And because that's ultimately what you're buying. You're trying to, professional team sports, ultimately, when you strip it away and strip away all, everything that we get passionate about, strip it away. When you look at it as a business, it's about taking financial resource and converting it into sport and performance. And there's two processes to that. And the sport and efficiency that I've written about on my blog, it's about, there's the efficiency by which you use the use your financial resource to acquire players. So how you allocate your wage budget, how you allocate the transfer budget. And that's what I call the transactional efficiency. And that's what the Moneyball story was about, was using data analytics to be more efficient in the player recruitment. But the other element of it is the ability then, how good are you at taking a squad of players, a roster, and getting sport and performance out of them? And that's what I call transformational efficiency. And that's about the efficiency of the coaching aspect. It's about the support staff, and analytics can play a role there. And it was that I did some work on player recruitment. I did a little bit of that initially when I went as at Alkmaar as a kind of, but Billy Beane was leading that, and my role was more to say, justify the value of that. My role, and at Saracens, I saw myself as very in that efficiency model that I was trying to contribute to greater transformational efficiency, in the sense of using that. Can you use the squad better to get better results overall? So that's ultimately, and that helped me. The great thing, the reason I was pulled by that was because, going right back to my childhood, I was always fascinated by the tactical side of football, and I've, some of the books that I pulled out of the public library were, any of the books that were on the tactics of football, and the books written about the total football of the Dutch in the early 70s, which we now call the pressing game. But the Dutch that's what the Dutch, it was a key part of how the great Dutch teams in the early 70s, and about the great Hungarian team and Puskás and so on. And, the ideas of total football, in some ways, what goes around comes around, and we get the same debates, different language, but it's the same debates that were, when England got beat for the first time at Wembley by the great Hungarian team, and that set off this, it's that debate about between the long ball game and the possession game. The debates about data analytics in football have recaptured that, because the first football analyst was Charles Reep. His work was about showing that, or what he thought he was showing was the power of the long ball game.
Yeah.
And in some ways things come around, go around, and now we're having the debate again because of the travails of the Guardiola in Manchester City. But it's evolution. People in every walk of life, and not just human life, in every walk of life, people learn from others and emulate and evolve. And people have evolved ways of playing Manchester City, which has coincided effectively with the original core of the Manchester City team aging. And so you've got the natural evolution of a team, in terms of, as new players come in and the veterans move on. You've got that coinciding with the fact that people have played Manchester City and Guardiola in the Premiership for a number of years now. They're beginning to learn how to play them and develop new tactics. One of which is to use the long ball more, to use using that tactic to switch play and attack much more quickly. And I think that's one of the things that Leeds have been more successful in this year. I think also that north of the border, Brendan Rodgers, Celtic have been a lot more effective this year, because they had a tendency in the past to have the ball going back and forth along the 18-yard line. And all that does is give the opposition plenty of time to get into the defensive shape.
Yeah.
And that's the problem with the Guardiola approach. If the slower you keep the ball, so they're not going to, the opposition ain't going to score because they ain't got the ball, but you're letting them get into the defensive shape.
Yeah.
And that defensive shape can be coached and practiced on the pitch, so it becomes very, very much more difficult to score. Even if you've got incredibly skillful players, it's very, very difficult to score against, particularly in football, against a team that's got very good defensive shape.
Yeah.
That was one of the things I was good at in my coaching, was coaching defense.
Yeah.
So it's sorry, I'm rambling a bit.
No. Excuse me. No, that's totally fine. You mentioned you brought up there Charles Reeve. I had it down to ask you about the game. For those listening that there might be some younger ones that maybe don't actually know that name, but in terms of the pioneer that kind of it was around the long ball. More goals are scored, with shorter sequences of passes, etc. So, and I've heard you kind of speak. I think it was in a blog post, Bill, in terms of the Reep fallacy. So,
Yeah.
can you just kind of explain what that is for those listening, and yeah, where that came from, really?
Yeah, I've got a very high regard for Charles Reep. When you read his life story, and how he was an accountant that worked with the RAF, and he started to follow football and became entranced by the tactical side of football back in the early 30s, listening to I think he went to a talk by the then captain of Arsenal, and then he started to collect data. And he did it paper and pencil. And just as we emerged after the Second World War, and then floodlights came, apparently the stories you'd see him in a miner's hat with a lamp at night games with his paper and pencil, and he had a miner's hat with lamp, and he gathered an amazing amount of data, it sounds like almost every game that was ever on TV, World Cup games, FA Cup games, and so on. He had his system for annotating and that. And he published 2 or 3 articles statistically. But interestingly, I don't know if you know, the very first club that took any notice of him back in the early 50s was a certain club called Brentford, who were in the old First Division and threatened with relegation. And he'd started his analysis, and the manager of Brentford at the time brought him in, and basically he espoused, well, look, the evidence is that more goals are scored when there are fewer passes in the move. So, and effectively, the more direct play, the long ball game is more effective. And that's the game that Brentford introduced for the second half of the season and avoided relegation. Now, in some ways, I think that it isn't necessarily the long ball game that's effective. I think there's a plan, and people know what they're doing, and they've got a way of playing, and so there are different ways of being effective. Reep had found that, on his data, he found and interpreted his data that there were more goals scored with possessions that had fewer touches, fewer passes involved. So, and as I said, Brentford, and then the great Wolves team of the 50s, they took an interest and so on, and then it got linked in with and the Norwegian FA became big fans of his. What I mean by the Reep fallacy is, and this was pointed out by they didn't call it the Reep fallacy, but it was a study that repeated. It was about 20 years ago. A study that repeated the Reep analysis, gathered the data, and their argument was that the problem with Reep's data was he was only looking at the possessions that resulted in goals, and when he looked at those. There was most of the goals were associated with possessions that had relatively few passes. But if you look at the game as a whole, that's not unusual. All that's reflecting the fact is that when you look at the game as a whole and look at all the possessions, irrespective of whether they're goals or not goals, the result at the end of the possession, so that you get more short passes. In fact, Anderson and Sally, in their book, The Numbers Game, they said that in some ways football's more like ping pong. It's a constant, change of possession, with occasionally teams hold on to the ball and play. But when you look, if you graph the total number of passes over all the possessions, surprise, surprise, you get that most of the possessions have very few passes, and so when not surprisingly, then if you take that pattern, that when the possessions, it's a downward sloping like that. So most of the possessions, most of the possessions are often are just one touch. There's not even a pass, or there's one pass. So you get this downward sloping line in terms of the number of possessions. And hey presto, if you just take a small subsample of that, the ones that goals are scored, you more or less get the same slope. So all of that Reep was reflecting. What Reep was finding was that most possessions in football have very few passes. But because he'd just taken a subsample, he inferred the outcome, and that's what I call the Reep fallacy. If you're only looking at one subset of outcomes, you can draw the conclusion: that those outcomes, goals scored, are because there are relatively few passes. No. what it's a reflection is that there are relatively few passes in football, full stop, when you compare it on a possession by possession basis. And that's what I mean by the Reep Fallacy, that you can get quite misleading recommendations if you are very selective in what you're looking at. And he was looking at only in those studies, he was looking at only those case possessions. He sorted okay, let's see. His thinking had been, we're interested in what's causing goals scored. Let's look at the possessions that are goals scored. But you've got to compare them against the possessions that aren't. And in fact, once you do that, there's a higher propensity of goals. There's more goals percentage in terms per possession from possessions with more passes.
Yeah.
So you get the opposite. And the reason for that is that possession, as a number have commented on, possession and being able to retain possession means being able to pass completion. That's a better indicator of the overall quality of the team. Mm. The more ability you have to hold on to the ball, you need quality to do that, particularly as you move forward and moving into a compressed space where you've got defence and you're closed down more. It's relatively easy to build up lots of passes. And completed passes if people are leaving you in your own half to do it and falling back, and that's once that you control for that, you actually find that there's there's more chance of scoring with possession, or more possessions, let's say, that have got 7 or more passes. There's a higher proportion of those end up in goals than possessions with 2 or 3 passes, which is in some ways the total obverse of what the conclusion that Reep was pulling. So that's what I mean by the Reep fallacy. And you find it in lots of different walks in life where conclusions have been drawn on the basis of looking at a non-representative sample. And particularly this excluding the outcomes that you're not interested in, not in this case not scoring, and just focusing on the scoring. And you can get quite misleading implications if you don't use the whole sample and get a representative sample, rather than this one was a very selective sample. But what it was representative of not scoring, yet there was a conclusion being drawn about the goal scoring.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. So we'll stick with the football theme. So you've got experience. You did some work with, you mentioned it anyway, AZ Alkmaar. So that was kind of after you obviously done rugby as well. So with Saracens and London Irish. So again, we'd be here all day if we spoke about everything, Bill. So I'm going to have to skip a little bit over that because I want to ask you about AZ Alkmaar. Yeah. Was that, by the way, did you work with Arne Slot there? Was he there when you were there, or?
Yeah, no, I was fortunate to during my 5 years at AZ. AZ was a baseball connection. I'd gone to Saracens. That was through. I'd started to do some work. Phil Clark, the ex-Wigan and England Rugby League player, him and his brother had a sports data consultancy, the sports office based in Wigan, and they found out about my work, and I did some work with Phil and his brother, and then I worked with Phil at Sky on Sky Sport, and for 3 years provided all the statistical analysis to support their coverage of Super League, including developing a performance gauge. And Phil told his best mate from his Wigan days about me, Andy Farrell. Fast told Brendan Ventnor at Saracens. So I ended up going to Saracens and working there for 5 years with the coaches. So I came in, unlike football. The gatekeeper that brought me into Saracens, the two were senior coaches, the director of rugby and Andy Farrell, who was one of the coaches. And that's where I worked there purely on with the coaches, analysing to begin with Saracens' own performances. And then I moved into working on the opposition, and particularly starting to analyse the opposition that played in other leagues for European games. So I started to. So I worked there for 5 years, and I took that as far as I could, and then I got the opportunity. And I think 5 years kind of worked. After 5 years, I was saying the same thing. It was less effective, and by the time I left, they were on the cusp of becoming European champions. So. The first season I was there, they won the league for the very first time in their history, and by the time I left, they were regularly competing in the semi-finals and reaching the finals. And then the season after I left, they won the European tournament for the first time. I got the opportunity to move to AZ through Billy Beane. Robert Eenhoorn was a Dutchman who played ball at college and had gone to college in the States and had been drafted by the New York Yankees. And Robert ended up playing around about 45 games, I think, in the major leagues. He calls himself a 4A player. He was too good for the triple A's, but not good enough to nail down a starting position. But he went back and ran for many years the national baseball operation, and they were incredibly successful at the European and world level. And so Robert became a very, very well-respected sports administrator. AZ Alkmaar are a relatively small club, small town, famous mostly for its cheese market, but a relatively small town. And they had a history of doing things their own way. Complete opposite of the Ridsdale Leeds. They had a small budget, they stayed on budget, and had a history of being innovative and doing things their own way to try and be competitive with the big three in Dutch football, Ajax, PSV, and Feyenoord. So Robert was brought in to manage. He was head of the whole of not only the sporting operation but the whole club. But he had a marketing and finance director that basically reported to him on the business side, so that Robert could concentrate on the management of the sporting side. First thing he did was use his baseball connections to reach out and contact Billy Beane, and he got Billy involved as an advisor to the board. And Billy had a group of people based in San Francisco that were crunching the numbers for player recruitment. One of Billy's first pieces of advice to Robert was get Bill involved. So Robert came over. I was in Australia at the time. Robert contacted me. When I got back from Australia, Robert came in. We spent 2 days holed up in a hotel in the centre of Leeds talking about how to run a football club and how to run it properly, the role of data analytics. Absolutely amazing. A couple of days where we just talked about, our experiences at the elite level and what to do. And it was immediately apparent that Robert and Billy they were chips off the same shoulder. The way they looked at things, very, very astute, had played the game, so they understood the game as a shirt, but they also were very business savvy, so they understood the game as suits and were able to, and had respect in the dressing room as well as in the boardroom. Amazing characters. I've been very, very fortunate, along with Brendan Ventnor and others, to be mentored by people with that of that caliber. So Robert brought Billy in as an advisor and started on the recruitment. And one of my first roles was to sell the use of data analytics to the recruitment side. We looked. Robert's plan was, there's 3 elements to the football club in terms of the sporting operation. There's the academy, there's scouting, there's the first team operation. We looked at the academy. It was state of the art in terms of progressiveness and using data analytics. AZ had do things in youth development totally different from the Ajax model. Most of the British clubs copy the Ajax model. Get the kids in as young as possible, sign them at 8, take them out to playing with their mates on a Saturday and Sunday, and put them into an academy, and then at 16 select the very best for full-time scholarship. AZ's approach and their first team is totally dominated year on year by academy products. They leave the boys playing in local football until they're 11. And put all the resource into supporting the coaches. And they've got links with 162, in the order of 160, 170 local clubs, and they support the coaching. They'll bring the better kids in during the school holidays, but they don't pull them out of local football until they're 11. They feel that that's a better environment for them to grow up and develop their basic skills with good coaches, with their mates, rather than getting them pulled out of that. So we looked at that. AZ's academy was developing young players, and it was developing young coaches. It was developing young support staff. So people like yourself, starting as video analysts, were starting at the academy. So that box was immediately, one afternoon, absolutely blown away about how. So I remember being there an afternoon with Robert, and interestingly, the person that was working with Robert at the time to gain experience of management was Greta Steinson, the Bolton and Icelandic international, who's now the technical director at Leeds, and has just assumed overall responsibilities for the 49ers international football operations. So I guess it's Greta that's going to be involved if the 49ers do acquire a majority stake in Glasgow Rangers, which will be an interesting development for a Celtic and Leeds fan, but that's another story. But so Greta and I, with Robert, had a day at the academy, blown away with how that box was ticked. The next on up was the scouting, and I was told, ex-player, but very go-ahead, very open, and we had a great conversation. And it was him that made the comment about when he'd been surprised when I said that, but Billy goes and watches players, particularly the possible international recruits that Billy Beane goes in season. And that it was clear that that's why he made the comment about Moneyballs and Albatross. It's a bit misleading in that respect. And I said, yeah, it's evidence based, and the evidence, the data is just not the numbers; it's the totality, and that. So that was ticked off. So the next was the first team. That's a bigger hurdle to in any club to that. So what started was there was a performance analyst, a very good performance analyst who was very progressive. So he was analysing the video and that. So what I started to do was to get the Opta data and starting to analyse the opposition, and to do a complementary report on each of AZ's games on the basis of the published data, the Opta data, that would complement what was being done in-house within the first team. But I was reporting to Robert and to the technical directors and the scouting staff, and then they were disseminated. But in the first instance, it was the executives in the football operation that were receiving my work. But they had a policy to gradually bring analytics into the day-to-day operation. The first major development in that was to appoint an assistant coach with the agreement of the head coach, who was analytically aware and progressive. And that was a certain character called Arne Slod. And then, so Arne became became my point of contact, particularly when he then became head coach. So analytics was brought into the first team and expanded in the first team through the appointment of a specific appointment of a coach that was that way orientated. And I found, so I was based in Leeds. I'd be going over on a regular basis to see games and so on. So when Arne, early doors, I had a meet. Arne had his own analyst working with him prior to coming to AZ, but that wasn't the way that AZ operated. They basically said, "Look, we're developing our operation, and we've got Bill's, we've got the video analyst, we've got Bill, and that." So I met with Arne. He'd been seeing my reports. And I said, what could I do? What type of analysis would be most useful for you? So we sat in his office for an hour or so, and he basically said to me, I don't think I'm giving anything away here, that what he needed to understand about opponents was basically how they used their possession. So what I started to develop was an analysis of passing networks. And I developed some graphics to accompany that. So I started to develop network analysis, applying it to passing and developing graphics and ways to extract key recommendations from the graphics about how teams played. And that then became a crucial part of the report that I was providing after the weekend game with regard to AZ and the opposition analysis. So particularly also with regard to the opposition analysis, I'd be studying and creating a passing network graphic for the opponents and trying to identify. And that's the way. That's how I operated up until I had 5 years at AZ, and I think we'd got to the stage, and with Arne as head coach, that we got to the stage, and I agreed with Robert. I prompted the conversation. I thought we'd reached the stage by the summer of 2019 that we needed. It was appropriate for a full-time local analyst to be working with Arne rather than me working from a distance on a part-time basis. I thought they needed someone who, was fluent in Dutch, who was going to be there day in, day out, and could work in combination with Arne Slot as head coach and with the video performance analyst. And Robert and I agreed that in the summer of 2019. So I stepped back at that time. I was going to have a break because I've been sort of full on from 2010 to 2019, kind of full on with a career as an analyst, data analyst in sport, as well as with being an academic professor. So I stepped back, and then the pandemic hit the following year. And in a sense, that step back has become a step back for about 5 or 6 years. The next role I see is probably being able now to consolidate this and try and talking with people like yourself and doing a podcast with you to try and try and consolidate everything that I've learned. There are also some things that I've still want to develop. There are in terms of where my thinking statistically, analytically has gone, and trying to then bring that back. I think that I've developed, by stepping away from sport, I think I've developed my understanding of the use of data by stepping back. It's difficult to do that when you're full on, but I've been able to step back, and there's certain things that I'd want to try and develop further, certain ideas that have come up. A lot of it's around the problems of that the various metrics we use, there's considerable overlap in them, that they share. The information in the metrics is shared across metrics, and trying to consolidate that information in a more useful way. And that's what I've been working on. It's so there's certain, I think, by stepping back and concentrating, if you like, on my sports analytics and data analytics teaching, that's helped me. I've always found my teachings a way to really consolidate my thinking and get it down to the, what are the crucial things that I really have learned and want the students to take away from it. So that's where I'm at the moment, is just trying to consolidate. I think the difficulty I probably face, because I've stepped away, I don't have the access to the data, and it's a bit like, human beings can't exist without a supply of water. Well, data analysts can't really exist without a supply of data. So I've got enough data piled up to, historic data sets to experiment in that. But yeah, I think I've got one more practical involvement with a team left in me, where I think, but it would have to be with the right people, people that I would welcome to work with, and where I think I could make a useful contribution. So I haven't quite hung up my boots yet, or hung up my laptop with respect to that, but I'm definitely in that phase of sort of consolidating and hopefully trying to get some of what I've learned, get that in front of a wider audience of people who, the new generations of analysts, and getting that, because I think I've done a lot, but I've been so busy, if you like, being involved with teams, that I probably haven't taken as much haven't spent as much time as I should have done actually getting the message across to a wider audience. Maybe that's what I should concentrate more on. And certainly, I think there's a book on. I've got a couple of interesting books on sports analytics. I think that I can write.
Yeah, definitely. So speaking again, I won't keep you too much longer, Bill. We have probably gone over the hour mark in a minute, but I do want to ask you a little bit more on advice. You mentioned the next generation of analysts and stuff, and obviously people that watch this channel watch it to learn from the guests like yourself. So, firstly, just on kind of coming from a non-sporting background. So, like I said, I get lots of messages in my kind of inbox of, I've got an economics degree or different kind of degree, and I want to work in my passion, which is sport. Obviously, you've done that. So, a bit of advice on people in that situation, but also around mentors, because I heard you drop the word mentor in this conversation, today, in terms you mentioned like Brendan, you mentioned who's friend and mentor to yourself and other people in your career. So how important, and maybe you've mentored people yourself, Bill, but where do you think mentors fit into a career in analysis, and how people can maybe approach mentors or find mentors?
Right. Well, I think being able to talk with people who've got that knowledge and expertise about the game that you is one type of mentor, and that was the type of mentor that I needed. I think I needed a combination of a mentor and a senior gatekeeper, and someone that would believe in me and give me some credibility, because that was the difficulty of trying to get into football. I remember one young video analyst who worked for a Premier team, and he was very innovative, and he'd done his searches. I won't name him, but you might well have knocked into him because he was working the Premiership round about Europe. In fact, it was just after I'd finished my work with Billy Beane, and with Billy, I'd been working with the Oakland A's owned San Jose Earthquakes and the MLS. So as that work, we'd finished effectively that work. We'd done it for 3 seasons. We'd taken it as far as we could. And so I was looking around, and this would have been 2010, early 2010. I was coaching football. I was looking for the next challenge in terms of analytics. And there, I made some presentations. I made a presentation at one Premiership club. Interestingly, the manager had sent his apologies. And then I realised why the manager had sent his apologies. Everyone else, including the finance director and the coaches and that, it was a Wednesday afternoon. A lot of them came. We had a really good group, really good discussion. The manager, however, had decided that he was better spending his time that afternoon with 2 journalists. The reason I know that was because they were in the queue in front of me in the restaurant, in the club restaurant. So that's what he decided. Well, maybe keeping the press on side, the media on side, was more important than learning about analytics. But there was another club I went and talked with, and this young analyst had done his video research, and he'd thrown my name up, and he'd probably done a search, Billy Beane, Moneyball, and had thrown up this name, Bill Gerrard, that seemed to be linked with Billy Beane. So he invited me down, and and he organised a presentation initially, and he got the grand total, including himself, of 4 people out of the whole of the coaching and support staff came. So I did the presentation and that. So this would have been January, and he kept pestering the manager about the analytics. You need to talk to this guy. And he kept pestering. I think kept sort of bending the ear of this Premiership manager, and I then got and I thought, nothing's going to come of this. I've been this here before. I've seen this so many times, and even in Bolton, where there had been some interest, and I did a report. Ultimately, Bolton decided they weren't going to use an outsider. They were going to try and do what I was doing, do it themselves. So eventually I get the managers. It was 2010. The managers. I'm trying to set up a meeting when he gets back from South Africa from the World Cup, and I never had anything more. By this time, I'm beginning to. I've decided that I've got this opportunity to get involved with Saracens. But then I guess this email, and I felt really sorry for the analyst, because he was apologising to me, and I thought, no, it's you're the one who's, had a hard time, that you've been trying to persuade a manager about the value, potential value. And what this manager said, okay, I'll meet with him, but you make it clear I'm not prepared to spend one penny on data analytics. And so I got this rather apologetic email, and I said, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. It's a fairly common reaction. Why do you think I haven't done any work in English football? And it's not because I'm asking for a load of money, and it's got nothing to do with the financial side. I said there's an old school approach, and this was 2010. That there's an old school approach, and it's very, very difficult to break that down. So I've been lucky that the people I've called mentors have been people who've had the expertise about the game. So Phil Clark in rugby league, Andy through Phil, Andy was the conduit to a link with, and I've got I have not in any been surprised about how successful Andy Farrell's been, because Andy Farrell adopts the same approach to coaching as he did as a player. He puts his heart and soul in it. His son's exactly the same. Owen, chip off the old block, that Owen. There's something in that, in the DNA of the Farrells. They just give it their all, and Andy Farrell's become and he was great to work with as a coach. Indeed, all the Saracens coaches were phenomenal to work with. So Brendan Ventnor. Brendan's was a great mentor, because he's a qualified doctor. He's got a medical practice back in Cape Town in South Africa, and he adopts the same approach to medicine, to coaching as medicine. He told me quite early on, I don't treat diseases, I treat people. And I use the best evidence I have available to make a decision on what I should do. He says, I don't coach players, I coach people, and I make the decisions that I do on the best evidence. So he was open. Also, Saracens had a statistical mentality, with a small s, that they saw things as putting in place ways of doing things that would improve the likelihood that they would be successful. They knew, they from the very outset, they recognized that you're always dealing with probabilities. There's no certainty in sport. If there was, it wouldn't generate the passion that it does. There's no certainty. What you can do is try and do the things that will give you a better chance of success, and that was in their mentality. So in some ways it fitted. So the mentors I've had have been people that by chance I've met. I only met Billy Beane because there was a professor in the business school at Stanford who taught sport management, and was a big rugby league fanatic, who knew what I was doing in football and knew Billy Beane. And he told Billy Beane about what I was doing in football. And Billy Beane had developed an interest in football. And him and the Auckland leadership had gone to the World Cup in Germany in 2006. So, in a sense, mentors are absolutely crucial. A very difficult to answer is how you identify that, because honestly, I've been so lucky, which is a strange thing to say when you're when you work with data. But I've been incredibly lucky and fortuitous that someone who people that connected me with people, so that I got the credibility and then got connected through that, and then people have, he knows what he's talking about. And so I've been very, very fortunate in that. As I said, I think that Phil Clark, Brendan Ventnor, Robert Einhorn, Billy Beane, they've all been incredible influences on me, and also they've stood me in good stead. So it was Billy that then introduced me to Robert, so I've been very, very fortunate in that respect. But mentors, people that you can learn from, and particularly mentors who've got different experiences to you. So my experience was with analytics. I didn't really need mentoring, because I was, in some ways, given when I started this, I was, I was pushing at the curve at early doors. I was I guess I was one of the first to even attempt this in football. So I didn't need the there wasn't going to be guidance. I didn't need the guidance in terms of statistics and that. What I needed guidance and help on was understanding the environment, understanding the context. And that's what, in a sense, the failure I've had is I've never contributed to, in any meaningful way, to the development of analytics directly within English football.
Yeah.
And I think early doors there were a number of reasons for that, but I've never managed to get linked in with a flag bearer, someone that would, and I know people at Leeds United, for example, but and the 49ers talked to me because of the Oakland connections. I talked to the 49ers, they were told about me before they even when they first started. I talked with them about 8-9 years ago when they were starting their due diligence, and they were told, "Oh, there's this guy someone in San Francisco, the Bay Area, told the 49ers there's a guy in Leeds who's an analyst, who's a university professor. He's a Leeds United fan. Talk with him; he'll give you a lot of background." And and I think part of the problem in football still focuses the analytics on the recruitment side.
Yeah, definitely.
And they bring in specialist analysts. And I have the sense that these days, there's two things go against the type of work that I'm doing and where I'd want to go and replicate the kind of things I was doing at Saracens. First of all, it seemed to be the head coaches patch. So executives elsewhere are in the business are not inclined to be seen to be treading on toes. So I don't think there's anyone at Leeds United would tell Daniel Farke about me, even though there's several people at Leeds United know about what I do. No one would tell Daniel Farke, and I think that's happened in other football clubs, that there's a wariness about stepping on toes, and I don't think that I'm seen to be sophisticated enough in terms of what I'm doing in terms of recruitment. I think they've got that the data analytics on the recruitment side is being very heavily pushed as in economics by the technicalities and the sophistication of the technique. Whereas I've always adopted, I can do a lot of the sophisticated stuff, but in a sense, it's KISS, keep it simple. So you've got to be able to, a really good analyst can take the practical problem that the coach faces or the manager, whoever it is you're dealing with, translates it into an analytics problem, and then takes the results and translates them back into practical recommendations. And you've got to be able to move between the languages. I focused a lot more on understanding the context and using the techniques, the sophistication of the techniques. I think you've got to be careful about how sophisticated the techniques are you're using, because you've got to be able to translate the results back and provide very clear real world justifications. You can't sell something to a football coach, just like you can't sell something to a product manager based on the fact this has been generated by 3-stage least squares. Yeah, but is it any use? Or have you produced what I call statistical BO, which is, am I allowed to say that, the bleeding obvious? And there's a number of times where, and I recount a particular case in I was on a pitch before a match, having a walk with the coaches. This was at London Irish, and we're walking. And I'd sent them a piece of work that I was quite proud of, and had no reaction. And so I asked them, and I can't remember which pitch it was. We might actually have been at the game at Saracens, and I was walking the pitch. And they basically said, yeah, it was interesting, but we already knew that. And because that was one of the first things Brendan Ventnor told me was, I'd done a bit of work, and he, on my own, to prove show what I could do. And he came back to me and said, you've put into numbers our intuitions. Why don't you come down and find out about this, learn about this, and get involved? And then he said, but we're expecting that you won't always be, confirming what we already know. We're expecting that you will question what we know, and that you're going to produce some surprises along the lines. And that's, as I say, I call this the statistical BO, that you've got to be able, to understand what the purpose is, what the problems are, translate that, do that using appropriate techniques, but you've got to be able to translate it back. And a lot of the stuff I do is relatively basic in statistical terms. I use one or two more sophisticated techniques when there's a specific role. But I think the data analytics, it strikes me, the data analytics in football now on the recruitment side, there's an atmosphere in it that's very similar to economics. I call myself the undisciplined economist because I've got out in the real world enough, I think, and out of academia enough that I'm not stuck in the framework of looking at economic problems from the traditional academic approach. I look at the economic problems more. My starting point is a practical problem, and then trying to use techniques from economics as appropriate. But I've wandered around the business school. I'm in the management. I've been in the economics department. I've been in the accounting and finance department. I've been in the management department. I'm now housed in the analytics, technology and operations department. I've wandered around because I've been analysing business. And I think to analyse a business problem, I need to understand economics. I need to understand accounting and finance. I need to understand management. I need to understand the ability to analyse data and to understand operations. So I'm undisciplined in the sense of I pull on what are appropriate disciplines and pull on appropriate techniques as necessary. I'm afraid that's a rather long-winded answer to, I really don't know how you set about getting a mentor because I've been lucky.
Yeah, no, definitely. So I've got one final question, Bill. So I can see a lot of books behind you there. So I always ask guests that come on if they have any recommendations for books, and it doesn't have to be sports analytics. It can be anything. So anything that you want to give a shout out to, and obviously we've mentioned Moneyball, obviously one that a lot of people do mention. But anything else, Bill?
Oh, right. Well, when I first went to Saracens, the very first day I was there, Andy Farrell had just come back from touring in America. With I think it was the England under 21s. It was the young team anyway, and he said, "Oh, there was a lot of TV coverage about this guy John Wooden, who just passed away." And I said, "Oh, John Wooden, he's the most successful college coach everywhere." And I started telling, he said he's one of the people I wish I'd met. And I said I'm fascinated by John Wooden. I'd learned about it, I'd read about it. There's a TED talk about him. It goes into the players' meeting. This is the first meeting that they'd had. They were at the start of summer training, just back from their halls. And Brendan Ventnor then mentions John Wooden. I came back into the coach's office at lunchtime. There's three of them sitting around the screen watching the TED talk. And that. So anything by John Wooden. I think great coaches are teachers. He started as an English teacher at a high school. Got landed. He got landed being responsible for the sports, so basketball. And he went to UCLA and became the most successful coach of a college basketball team ever. And he still remains the most, and was voted the coach in America. He was voted the greatest coach in the 20th century. Anything about Bill Belichick and the New England Patriots, because Bill Belichick was an analyst who worked with his dad. His dad was a coached in American football. And he's the epitome of the analyst who became the head coach and ran, incredibly successfully, ran the New England Patriots. So I think, there's several books. I've got, there's one, Patriot Reign. There's also The Education of a Coach. So anything about Bill Belichick. The two numbers game books. There's the numbers game by Anderson and Sally that's about football. But there's also a numbers game book. The original numbers game was by Alan Schwartz, and it's the history of numbers in baseball. Right. So it sets you the wider context of Moneyball, and you realise that the analysis of the data in baseball goes right back to the start of the 20th century. And that there was some really interesting work being done in the early 1900s in baseball. What else? There's I think I use the term invasion territorial team sports and the analysis of space, and that's where the spatial dimension. That's I think the leading edge in sports analytics in football and so on. And the sport where that's been developed most is baseball. Sorry, not baseball, basketball,
Yeah.
because it's a relatively small court and there's only 10 players in total on the field at any time. And there's a couple of books on basketball analytics by Shea. I'm trying to remember his first name, but it's basketball analytics. Is it? What's his first name? It's Stephen Shea.
Perfect. Oh yeah.
Yeah. So that the very first book I got that I read that introduced me to the possibilities of analytics in sport was The Hidden Game of Football. And by football, it's gridiron. There's an equivalent one by the similar authors called The Hidden Game of Baseball. But The Hidden Game of Football was absolutely fascinating. That's a book that dates back to I think the late 80s, early 90s. And they analysed games and given the segmentation on it of the way the game's played, they analysed it and the data they pulled out every possession, set possessions, and the time, what the time was, what the score was, and the field position, and they worked out a set of probabilities based on a massive data set, working out the probability. They were the first to say that teams were kicking too much on fourth down rather than running it. And that dates back, and that's been that hidden truth has been, rediscovered several times in more recent years. But, these people, as I said, it was hidden game. Wooden, yeah, anything on Bill Belichick, John Wooden, all of those, that in terms of analytics, totally left field. One of the recommendations I make for my students, either in sports analytics or in data, I teach a business analytics course, is to go and read Isaac Asimov Foundation. And I read lots of different genres. I'm one of the first science fiction series I read, and I've reread it several times, was Foundation. And I say, look, here's a fictional story about someone who's trying to predict not only how an individual world, but I know almost a whole galaxy by using statistical data. And the whole story of the foundation is about, that we can predict social, economic movements, in this case across a galaxy, using data. So I like to use that, say that, if you want some pre-course summer reading, light reading, read the book. It's a bit like Moneyball. There's much more in the book than there is in the TV series or the film. But yeah, Asimov, the Foundation, not only because it's an amazing science fiction series, but the heart of the story is using data analytics.
Yeah, definitely. Perfect. Well, I'm going to link them down below, Bill. Like I said, I'm going to also link your website, your blog down below as well. I just want to say thanks very much. Thanks for being generous with your time. I really enjoyed your story.
Thank you for the invitation, Chris.
No problem. I could speak to you all day, to be honest, Bill. So maybe we have to do another one in the future. But really appreciate your time, and hope Leeds get promoted. Hopefully, maybe we can join you in the playoffs as well.
Thank you for the invitation, and all the best in the playoffs.
Thank you very much. Cheers, Bill.
Okay, bye.